On the Janjusim Begi, Yamne, Passion to gain Yamne Naneda, Jimbada, Children, Sobat, something party and Chediba, Kishu Sare, kissing on the Tinya Matleshini or Mashu Savare, that didn't Mashu added on the Sheriff Yamne or Mashu area.
Good evening. So we've now, of the 6 perfections that bodhisattvas train in, we've looked at the first 5 last week, completing the perfection of concentration, looking at again, the attainment of calm abiding. So tonight we come to the 6th perfection, that of how to train in wisdom.
당원주게 8전 남녀 기시도 셔르게 8진 냠내세 디셔르게 8진 냠내라유도 디셔럽데 또 동유도 비셔럽라 고고래 동유도 비셔럽라.
In the context of the 6 perfections, wisdom refers to the wisdom realizing emptiness.
지나 셔르지당 셔럽시도 셔럽라나 간치라고 그러시네. 유기 넘버 제바체기 디단 디레나 말에서 제바체기 지게 남의 집이기 로데라 안시럽라고 그래.
So again, in the context of the perfections, then the perfection of wisdom refers to the particular wisdom realizing emptiness. However, the mental factor of wisdom in general, in its general usage, refers more to intelligence, or the utilizing of consciousness to investigate an object, to see whether it's like this or like that. So this is being introduced because the term in English, wisdom, we tend to connotate it with those who are wise will have wisdom, whereas the meaning in general is far broader and is literally would be translated as highest knowing. So often it's perhaps more accurately understood as intelligence.
셔럽 유유들라 디리나 마인 제바치베 셔라 데르 셔럽 데라 다 셔럽 묘몬제세다 아니 셔럽 개와 인해다 아니 미개와 인해 데네 용으로 와 셔럽라 셔럽라 개와 인해 용으로 미와 용으로 셔럽 데라.
Again, there's consciousness. That's amongst the 5 object ascertaining mental factors. That's translated always as wisdom. In its general understanding, it's the consciousness that investigates something. Is the object, is it like this, is it like that? How is this object? Coming to know the object. So this consciousness that that can also be translated as to know, or to understand, or to recognize. So the consciousness, wisdom in general, has these flavors to it, to know something, to understand something, to recognize something, which shows it's a more ordinary consciousness, not wisdom like the way we use it in English. So this consciousness, wisdom, can be of either on the side of virtue, a virtuous consciousness, or a non-virtuous consciousness.
니 디비 자와 집이네 제가 제여와 샘체 데네 쇠나 약고요래 데네 쥐나 아니 쥐약이 냐로 쥐나 데네 지나 탑시네 약고요라서 지게 샘체 소조 제라야 디제나 약고 데네 지오도 제바 제야다 지게 리피게 삼다다 안지가 지금 미고월 따비네 지금 데네 지나 고고한테서 데네 지나 고고한테서 말해서 비 제바 제제 고고따야 셰라 병구로와 디스 셰랍지 뇨모쟁이 셰랍지고 뇨모쟁이 셰랍지고 돼서.
When wisdom investigates an object, coming to a decision on a course of action, then this wisdom can be non-virtuous or virtuous. So when investigating a situation and deciding, yes, this sentient being, it's good to kill, and therefore the person embarks on the activity, for example, of fishing, the wisdom that led to the decision to fish and to kill sentient beings, this is, of course, non-virtuous. Or in another situation, when wisdom is utilized to decide on a course of action, and the decision is, I will lie to this person, I will deceive this person, then that wisdom too is on the side of affliction, or non-virtuous. And such illustrations of wisdom would be called afflicted wisdom.
So
again, such illustrations of wisdom are afflicted. These are afflictions, so they are called afflicted wisdom.
Dinishina and Shanley, Pembach to win, Dinichin Cola Pando Cheong, Dinichin Pando Cheong, Dushina Colia, Pando Shira Yonsa Martin, Jini Jebachine, Jebaji, Hoshanley, Pando Jevalea, Jebache, Mura Jebache, Dus Jebachine, Sherap Jimura Jebache, Sherap Mura, Diso, and the Gavation, you be Sherap Chagore, just the Disuli mean the Sherap sending mean Sheraps and Bish Dangore.
Again, when this intelligence or this wisdom is investigating a situation and comes to the decision, this particular course of action will bring benefit to others, then this consciousness is virtuous and it's called wisdom. Or investigating a situation decides on a course of action that won't bring harm, this is a virtuous consciousness and it is called wisdom. So those before would be called afflicted wisdom. This here would just be called wisdom or intelligence.
Yule Pagaya, Yule Zechidu, near Duken, Samlo della Sheba della Dingis, you current, you Korochibu, the Zechidu near Shanley, some mother Zechidu near Duken, Sheba della, and Dingis in Dingis mean Dagor, Dingis Lagorova. The sheriff said, you did in the Yako, Dijin Yama, Digardo, Diganis, Jebachegi, Jehendela, the sheriffs mean Dagor.
So the consciousness that is engaged in the investigation of an object is what is called wisdom. So when you hear this term wisdom, bear in mind these other synonyms which more commonly will convey the meaning more accurately, such as intelligence or coming to know the object, coming to understand the object or recognize the object through the utilization of one's intelligence. So then last week, or in the preceding weeks when you were looking at the perfection of concentration, another of the object ascertaining mental factors was looked at, and that was stabilization. And it's this mental factor that gets developed to the point where it can hold an object single-pointedly. So that's the utilization of the mental factor of stabilization. Here, the mental factor that's engaged in analysis is that of wisdom or intelligence.
Dinigi Shirab did Anzuki, Anzu Chasangula, Yovari, Anzu Karina, Yorvada, Kala Suvina, Tikanasuna, Yagre, Disuna, Yagres, Bicheba, Shira Yungure, China Shirab de la Yadu, Mangu Yungure, China Shirab to Yugi Chane, Yulia, and Yugi, to you Benerabajilia, Jebachea, Nakala Suyada, Duloro, Kanesi, China Yagadu said, Dinigi, Jebachea, Shirab Jingurua, and Dimin Biget, Anzuki, and Yudan Jebode. Di and Yuganishin Jungores, Digar Yuganishin, the Tebocanis Jungres, and then Dustin Gundele Jebachia Shirap. And the Nea Kiji Chipagi, and to say the Masona, the Midaba, sometimes the Kiji Chibas, and the Kiji Kanachi to Kiji Amaka, the Kiji Chimakanasha, to the Kiji Chibagi Jebachia, sometimes Midaba, maybe Shirap. On the Yatan, when the Danzuke, Dombani said the Kanashi, said Dombani, the Jebachiagi, and Dombani said, and Tianchi and Jawa Chua Kanashi, the nigger, Dom Tinup said the Kanashi, do Jebachia sometimes, Tianchi and Jawi, honey, Dombani sometimes shut up, Dombani and Jebachi shut up. That the dinner that the sheriff to Yugi China Taraga Chane, and the sheriff de la Taramabuchagurua.
This mental factor then of wisdom is a mental factor we all have. There are, depending on the object that one is investigating, there will be as in the same way that there are varying levels of subtlety of the object being investigated, so too will there being varying levels of subtlety of the investigating wisdom or intelligence. So, for example, when one is cooking a meal and deciding on which ingredients to utilize for the taste to be delicious and in what quantity and perhaps in what order, this is the utilization of wisdom or intelligence. But it's quite a coarse level. Similarly, when deciding what clothes to put on, we're using our intelligence there, our wisdom there. When we're meditating on impermanence, this is now a subtler object than that of preparing a meal or deciding what clothes to wear. The object's subtler, as is the investigating intelligence or wisdom. Likewise, when meditating on emptiness, this is now an even subtler level, a subtler consciousness, and therefore a subtler level of wisdom.
Adine zada sherap se dade manzo kapsu babe she dela tongi to be sherat tongi le cheba chene an tongi to be sherap di korma shyare manzo.
Primarily in the context of looking at the perfection of wisdom, one looks at the object of reality or emptiness and the investigating and later realizing consciousness of wisdom. So here, the term wisdom makes some sense, as opposed to, say, intelligence, but the object in the context of the perfection of wisdom is that of emptiness.
Passion to and Drupa she the Drupa, Sherapla Lapsuni, Sherap ki Parsing Yamsulin to the Carre Lamna, and Simgi Yukune Langdi, said the Guno de Lea, Simgi, Jashu Simja Tamji, Sanjoko, Toba Chiki, Simgi Yukunela. Then the Simgi Yukunela de Sibit Zawa, Drune, Jimbegi, Drune, Jinji, the Konayan, Duan Toba, the Nandope Sheraps, Jidan Sheraptilia. Yawalma so sumdi cheyung de donam to be sherap se chikje ane kunzup to be sherap se and dingi ye semjing ye duen je ba ane sherap namla la par cha go de se de sherap de la ya de sherap de la da ne tonyu to be sherap dan kunzup to be sherap an semjing ye duen je be to be sherap sen de sherap sum de la chanji samba mi de sherap sum ga la nyamna chi go res chanji sim yu kun de la che du sen nyamna chi go re jere.
That then was a general introduction to wisdom, to understand how it's utilized in general, and then now we come to the specific context of the perfection of wisdom. So turning to the text on the bottom of page 44, we have a brief outline which mainly or primarily denotes the three divisions of wisdom. So again, I have my own translation just so that it's much more literal and follows follows the Tibetan closely so that it matches Genla's presentation. With bodhicitta as the motivation, the wisdom that knows the ultimate, the realization of the meaning of reality that eradicates the root of samsara, the wisdom that knows the conventional, and by means of those two, the wisdom that knows how to accomplish the welfare of sentient beings must be trained in. Here then, we see initially, because this is a perfection, it's mentioned with bodhicitta as the motivation, and then it goes into the three divisions. And just a word here again on the translation. I've followed what some other translators do and translated the term that is almost always translated as to realize, rather as to know. So again, I mention this just so that one can approach the Dharma text with some lightness, knowing that one term in different contexts, such as wisdom, can mean intelligence or wisdom or to know or to understand. Likewise, the term to realize can also be, in some contexts, mean to know. So the three divisions again then, the wisdom that knows the ultimate, the realization of the meaning of reality that eradicates the root of samsara is the first. And the second, the wisdom that knows the conventional. And the third, by means of those two, the wisdom that knows how to accomplish the welfare of sentient beings.
Dadelia, Sibe Zawa Duni Jinji Lagor, Sibe Zawa Duni Jinji. Sibe Zawa Duni Jinji City, Mandu Sibe Korea di Korea Sibe Korea Horsia, Gidina Korea, the Carcio, you got a little Yungures and Leda, Nyomo Balatin and Leda, Nyomo Wonga Lesa, Legi Wonga Koala Kewalingores, Tisan Koala Kinlen, the Koalia, and Azugi, Navio Dunga, Nechig, Dungama, Chikanga Yunga, the Chazan Dires, Chazan Koala Kewalimba, the Kanga Jungore, Diga di Carson, Gudi Carson, Lelet in the Kewalimbares, Lady and Gugaras House, Nyomo Balatin Zawara Kewares. The Nyomo Banana Zawa de Carson, Zawa di Sibu doesn't marry by the race. Jizan di doesn't mind by Marie body of Juni Jinji as you do, the Meba Suedi, Zawanico Meba Suedi, Meba Sukin Carelane, De Conani, Dun Topa, De Conani said Tombani, so Tombani to be sheriff to the Ezra, De Conani, Dun Topa, said Tombani to be sheriff to the Jizan, Korea Zawa, De Carson, does it Dinzi Marie by the Ray, Dinzi Marie by the Zawan Meba Suedi, Nimbo de Carresne, De Conani, Dun Topa, so don't you to be sheriff to the Ezra. Dela Mingalas, Donam to be shared black creation. Jeda, Kowe Zawan, ne, Kowe Zawa, Dasin Marik body, Pasabona Jeva Payagi, Nimbo de Carson, don't you to be shared as Dela Mingalas and Donam to be shared black creation. De Konani, Dun Topa, Donam to be shared up down, city, De Konani, Topic, shared up Dela Ming, Donam to be shared up Silagri.
Text starts out with bodhicitta as the motivation. So this motivation is required as a basis for the training in all three of these divisions of wisdom. So looking then at the first, the wisdom that knows the ultimate. So this in brief is the first division, but the text expands on this a bit. The wisdom that knows the ultimate, the realization of the meaning of reality that eradicates the root of samsara. The second part of that sentence then explains the function of this first division of wisdom, the wisdom that knows the ultimate. So the second part of the sentence again, the realization of the meaning of reality that eradicates the root of samsara. So here one has come to recognize the suffering realms of samsara, the sufferings that are experienced within those realms, and the causes for these suffering, for the resultant suffering, which is the ripening of contaminated karma, and that contaminated karma is accumulated by our own afflicted minds. And the wide array of afflictions, they all have as their root the ignorance of self-grasping. The root cause of all suffering, the root cause of one's entire samsaric experience, samsaric existence, is the ignorance of self-grasping. To eradicate this, one needs to gain a realization of the meaning of reality. And that is then the meaning of the second part of the sentence, the realization of the meaning of reality that eradicates the root of samsara. And what is the realization of the meaning of reality? Is the wisdom that knows the ultimate, or the wisdom that realizes the ultimate. That is the wisdom that realizes selflessness or emptiness.
Elia Sibi Zawa City, Siba Labide Sibo Kowa the Sigurwan, Horwan Zugi. That Kowa led and you more Dunga 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 Chawa Dunga said, Siba said, Kowa this, Siba Kowa said. That Kowa Kiji you, and the led and Yomo Badiche. That Denam Gia, that Zawa the Carre Ladu, doesn't marry Ba City, doesn't marry by the race Zawa City. That Sibi Zawa, Sibo Kowa, and Kitke, you led and Yomoba, Tisoke Zawa the Sukare Lamna, Dinzi marry by the race. Sibi Zawa said the Siba said the Zawa said that by Chuchu by Donda Nili or Siba Lane, Sibo Kowa, you led and Yomoba. That did I get dinner, Zawa love you, that Jesu get Zawa the Garrison, Dinzi marry by the race, such Dilakor, Sibi Zawa said in it, 60.
In the text before you, you have wisdom which realizes the ultimate mode of existence, suchness, emptiness, that uproots samsara. So I'll rather stay with the translation that I've made here because it's more literal. And here it talks about the realization of the meaning of reality that eradicates the root of samsara. So, root of samsara. So samsara is known by two terms. One is samsara, another is existence. So these are two different words. And here, the root of samsara. So samsara refers to the suffering realms of samsara and the sufferings within them. And these come about due to contaminated karma, which is the result of our afflictions. The afflictions are the cause leading to the accumulation of contaminated karma. And all these afflictions have as their root the ignorance of true grasping or the ignorance of self-grasping. So here, that's the root of samsara. And what eradicates this? This is the realization of the meaning of reality. Or the Tibetan is literally the realization of the meaning of thatness. But we can understand it as the meaning of emptiness or the meaning of reality. That cultivation of that wisdom is what eradicates the root of samsara and gains freedom.
Drungni jinji la de kala warsne da sibi zawa denzin di sabona jeba zawa ne pangkan di meba sueken di se word drungni jinji diga re labne de kwana ni don do wa se don yu do be she de se word.
What does the actual act of uprooting or eradicating the root cause of samsara is the realization of the meaning of reality, which, to express that differently, is the wisdom that knows the ultimate, or the wisdom that realizes the ultimate, the wisdom that realizes emptiness.
Denegi tongbanyi tongyu dobi dekwana dobi sherap tongbanyi dobi sherap de la mingala rasne donam dobi sherap la gire jirida de.
The wisdom that realizes emptiness, here in the context of the threefold division, is called the wisdom realizing the ultimate. So what the text is presenting here, just in a few words, is one, the entire realm of suffering and its causes, as well as the solution to the causes, and then presenting three synonyms for that. The realization of the meaning of reality, or the wisdom realizing emptiness, or the wisdom that realizes the ultimate. So these we can understand here as synonymous.
Then Tigdi Hunu Madonna Sibit our Druni Jinji, De Kwana Dobegi, Duan Doba, Donandubi, Sherap said the Sigdi Hunu Madame, the Dundadi, the Lam Rim Text, Dundadi, and Atisha Chakore.
And in these half a dozen words or so, the realization of the meaning of reality that eradicates the root of samsara, in those half a dozen words or so, it's contained the entire meaning of the Lam Rim.
Denegi Sibit our Druni Jinji, don't you to be sure up the Sibit our Druni Jinji, in Siduda, and the Sibit Zawa de Tenzin Mari by the Korvik Zawa Rese, that the Imbigum de Lane, Penandawa Dabagi, no Majubana la Carson was in a Nyamon Jona Mali Chisola, Telechon, Louis Tonjurji. Dan in di yulo dojene na juba ye dane ka on go parti ese to somewhere.
So why is it said that the ignorance of self-grasping is the root cause of all of samsara, of all the suffering that we all experience? This is presented by Chandrakirtini's supplement to the Middle Way with the following verse in the 6th chapter. Having seen with intelligence that afflictions and faults, without exception, arise from the view of the transitory collection, and having realized that the self is the object of that, yogis refute the self.
Yes, la soba gyön chasan jikso la tawa de le jungwa re se jikso la tawa se de ngan ju jikda se je nga ju ge tenzin marik ba de la gore tenzin marik ba de da bene nyomo ba nyomo gyön na mali jikso la nyomo ba de de sha khon ro nga ja an jik de ni gi marik ba la soba de ni gi jik nyomo be gyön jik mang bo ji de so chasan de gyön ro de nga ju yung ro che de le nga ju de sha ji go khon ro ji go nga ja ji go re an di gi wang ge 先所觉吧的，先有古毛古啊啦说吧的，俺先来虐吧的，让先你个人你比原刚俺蒙古来的，俺弟妹是俺这个绿的个绿那这那呀，俺那这个初月冬啊冬啊，九月冬啊，七八月冬啊冬啊也俺这个这马这边原车上牛毛把的说了点离过来，就是牛毛把的说讲开始离过来是呢，되게 차상 규인 차상 녀모 바다 가서 내나서 로바상 가서 강아지 마리비 규인 요소 줘봐 아니 가르친 리고레스네 저기 유간시 리고레스네 직소를 직다 해야 될 텐데 이거래 직다를 텐데 저 직다 해야 되는 거 되지 다선 마리 봐야 될 지고래 됐을 텐데 리고레 됐을 자와 될 텐데 기와레스 요래 다선 시고 다선 거래 당가 저 텐주베기 시고로 와 텐주베라 저기 다선서라 가사게 나라 미시 템바투바 짐바들 다선레고 뉴 딘진제다 나 템바투베 집에 딘진세야 되시고래 다선 마릭발라는 나 템바투베 딘진데라 다선 마릭발라 거다 당가 저 텐주베기 시고로 와
I'll read the verse again. Having seen with intelligence that afflictions and faults without exception arise from the view of the transitory collection, and having realized that the self is the object of that, yogis refute the self. So looking then at the first two lines, having seen with intelligence that afflictions and faults without exception arise from the view of the transitory collection. So here, what Chandrakirti is stating, that it's from our afflictions that we suffer. The mere arisal of the afflictions, such as the wish to bring harm to others, causes us to suffer. The arisal of anger, the arisal of attachment, the arisal of pride, the mere arisal of the afflictions cause us to suffer. And acting out under their influence, we kill, we steal, and so forth, and cause others to suffer, create the causes for our further suffering. Similarly, through the arisal of the afflictions and the accumulation of contaminated karma, we have contaminated aggregates, and we suffer. We have this basis of suffering, upon which, or this physical basis of suffering, we experience illness and other physical harm. So therefore, our mental suffering and our physical suffering comes about in dependence on our afflictions. However we divide suffering, whether it's into, say, the threefold division of suffering, with the suffering of physical and mental harm, the suffering of transient pleasure, or the all-pervasive suffering, these come from our afflictions, or come about in dependence on our afflictions. And our afflictions have as their root cause, as it says here, having seen with intelligence that afflictions and faults without exception arise from the view of the transitory collection. So the view of the transitory collection is explained differently in dependence on the differing philosophical tenets. According to the Prasangika, it is the ignorance of self-grasping. So therefore, all suffering, physical or mental, or the suffering of the suffering of physical mental pain, the suffering of transient pleasure, and all pervasive suffering, it all comes from the ignorance of self-grasping, which can be expressed as it is in this verse by Chandrakirti, by the view of the transitory collection.
Da delia jigda labne nga zubi nga sebe soso nga la mi je nga ane demba druba zimbe ting zin le jigda la gore ma zu tenzin chasang la jigda la gore be nga zu chiro ge choksu tenpa chupa zinya disu jiga kangpa la sopa choksu la so shen rang le shen be gangsa la sopa tenpa chupa zimba ina disu chasan jenzi re de ina jikda ma re disu jikda la go ma re gangsa shenda tenpa chupa zi mi shenda tenpa chupa zimba zinzi yorba su su la disu jenzi re de ina jikda ma re bene rang le nga le rang le shen be gi an jiga 치료가 유라서바다 간사 현달로서바 템버주버 진바이나 디텐진제 이내 직다 말해 돼서
Having seen with, so looking at the same two lines, having seen with intelligence that afflictions and faults without exception arise from the view of the transitory collection. So the first few words here, having seen with intelligence. So again, just to say that when one approaches translations, approach them with a light attitude. Because here, what the translation is what the Tibetan says, having seen with intelligence. The meaning behind that is having realized. So when we're approaching a Tibetan translation, approach with an understanding that there may well be meanings that the words don't necessarily express. So here, having seen with intelligence means realized, and because of the context, realized by a bodhisattva who has attained a path. Here, the cause of all suffering is explicitly mentioned as the view of the transitory collection, which is the ignorance of self-grasping. And we know already that the ignorance of self-grasping is synonymous with ignorance of true grasping. But here, a point that should be mentioned, that all illustrations of true grasping are not necessarily illustrations of the view of the transitory collection. The view of the transitory collection relates to oneself. It doesn't relate to grasping at other persons as being truly existent, or phenomena such as the table that are other than oneself. So the view of the transitory collection relates to grasping at oneself as being truly existent. It doesn't relate to phenomena other than oneself. Those one would still be grasping at as truly existent. There would be illustrations of the ignorance of true grasping, but they would not be illustrations of the view of the transitory collection, which relates to grasping at oneself as being truly existent.
다니 디유로 도체네서 다치사 직다세디 유 가르 징구도 셈비게 제바 치리갑라 다 세딩아 규나게 차셰 뢰파 샤발라마도 랑원은 줍도 행기 나지 징구여바디 직다디기 데네게 나 징구여바디 유디 그 진당의 유디 나 데네게 데버주버 짐바 임바데 하고 와래서 다니 디유로 도체네서 다 세데라 다니 용거데 저게 다 세디 저게 템버 마주바 지단에 군주도 옆에 다 세디 나잠 세죠 그래 다 데레 미야 데레 미고래 데레 미제 아니 딩아잠 데레 나 여디게 딩아데레 여가 데레 미제 아니 디 가네스 난고레스네 가네스 난고레스 데네 나디 셴라마텨바 르 샤바다 긴 차셰 샤라마도 랑궁은이 주바신 nengores다 nengores 데네 나와 나신 데시도 세메 징고레스 제가 나다도 주 나다 나 군주 나들레 미데 나디 다도 주바 나와 나신 진 다도 주바 징고레스 제가 디 나다도 주바디 디기 똑바디기 직다디 유리레스 유인바데 하고와레스 난주바디 제바체 데네 하고네 아니 가서 난주바에 다녀 고파르지에서 난주비게 데네게 다디 두에 메도 안 텐진 제와서 제바체세 데네게 다디 고고레스 메바 근데 고고레지레 다니로와 다 맞음 세치지다 여바 지여로 와가 내가 맞음 여바데 니 당보디 nga zam se de yoro wa da nga khala se nga ru ge nga joro wa de ni ge nga la mi che ane nga mi do na yo de kan s nang go se lo la na yo de ka la ma rang mo ni tu ba na go de ni rang go de tu ba na shi na wa na shi du se be sam lo ta yo de din sim ba di da ta do tu ba se do sim ba se go nga de la ga la ya ma de rang go ngwe ne tu be ge da ji ga che da le di yo ma le yin ne nga zo di jing go le di sim ba de no chu cha de yo ba ji dang nga se ji dang nga kun zu be nga ta yo ba se de yo ro ba ye de ro da ji dang nga de le ji dang ni che go ye be nga ji dang me be nga ni che go da kun zu be nga de ro de na yi do o de na ka le ma do rang wen de be na wa na xin da de yo ma le so nga kun zu be nga sia da da du be nga da du be nga am di ko da du be nga de yo ma le kun zu be nga de yo le so
There are two types of self. There's one that exists and one that does not. The type of self that exists is the conventional I, or the mere I. So this is the self that does exist, and the self that doesn't exist is the truly existent self. So the self that appears to our mind as being, or appears to us as being independent of causes, independent of parts, independent of imputation by mind. This self doesn't exist. But another consciousness will grasp at it as existing in the way that it appears. And that consciousness, because it's grasping at an object that doesn't exist, in a sense believing it to exist in the way that it appears, is an ignorance. And it's an ignorance that is grasping at the self. And it's grasping at a self that appears to be independent. So it's grasping at a self that doesn't exist. And this is the ignorance of self-grasping. And yogis, they investigate this self and come to refute it, to realize that the self, despite appearing in this way as truly existent or as independent, does not exist in this way. And that then is the remainder of the verse. Having realized that the self is the object of that, yogis refute the self.
안수 숨가게 상기게 디 신도들 때고래 당 안수 돈이 마도 안수 신도들 때고래 당 돈이 또게 자주 선바지게 되라 베네 신도들 때고래 안수 숨가 신도들 때고래 당 안수 숨가게 신도들 미고 신도 통고로 와다 또 지바래 디 지바래 신도들 미바 지바래 다수 나용도 가서 난고르스네 안수라 신도디 규단健康란 뭐 랑문이 주바 난고래 안수래 다 돈이 또 그냥 전주선바들이야 디니기 신도데 전주선바 소람바다 저람바 소소기다 돈이도 디니기 찍라 아니 돈이 가서 신나이데 나와서 나와나신 강라마도 랑문이 주바 능고 나와서 집받는 거래 상계라 디나 나서도 능고 말해 강라마도 랑문이 주바 능고 싸우기 능고 말다 능고 말 나나 백카가 최고래 덴바 마주바 나디 거래 and that's all on Jolamba, the society would have.
Let's look at this further and take an illustration of a piece of fruit. So we have a piece of fruit, and three different beings are looking at that piece of fruit. So they're all seeing the same piece of fruit, but how does it appear to their minds? So, for ourselves, the piece of fruit appears to the mind as being truly existent, or independent of causes. That's how it appears to our consciousness. For ordinary bodhisattvas, so those who have not yet realized emptiness directly, those on the paths of accumulation and preparation, the piece of fruit appears to them in the same way as it appears to us. But for the third type of being, a Buddha, there's no appearance at all of true existence.
나 나랑 줄라 다다 전시 선바당 나랑 주니들라 신도 나요들라 간来랑문에 주바 능고래 다 나는고래 다 나랑 주가 소선 나와 나신 다가라래 섬진거랑 나랑 주길래 디침바 슈침부죠래 짐바요래 다 디동이 또 책엔 전시 선바들이 된는거래 나와 나신 말에서 거다 나와 나신 저기는 요 말에서 어두 섬거다. 제가 난거데 나와나 덴버주버 진거 말에. 덴버주버 간래마 랑원도 주버 나와 난거데 나와나신 말해 섬거래. 但俺주기데 나와나신 레 섬거래. 진주어 덴버주버 진거로 와다.
So of those three beings, let's look at the first two categories. So for the ordinary beings such as ourselves, the piece of fruit appears to be independent. So not something that has come about in dependence on causes and parts and imputation, but independent of that, truly existent. And we strongly grasp that this is correct, that this is how the fruit exists, that this appearance is in accordance with reality. We strongly grasp that what appears to our mind is valid, is correct. The ordinary bodhisattva, who has not gained a direct realization of emptiness, the piece of fruit appears to their mind in the same way, but they know that it does not exist in the way that it appears. So it appears to them in the same way, but they don't grasp at it nearly as strongly. So the way of interacting or relating to what appears to the mind is vastly different for an ordinary bodhisattva and an ordinary being such as ourselves.
나 변행하는 dumdi orda jasan 변행하는 주게 지게 시어고 나르바 맞아 직 다주 아니 직 샘제 직 시미로 시나가래나 직 파 시어고 나르바 된 샤바나 페니수 토도 시어고 나르바 시미로 시셔고래 당 아우즈레 미글레 시미나시 셔지부지가 시어고래 공심들레 거지부지가 시어고래 이내 당 아우즈 가서 디 나와나신 시명원에 말해서 뭐도 힘을 해서 배삼로도 셴바 균해요 말아서 심바 싸우기네 말했어. 다 힘을 걸어야 그게 두 선비 나래 셴베 심이 현다시 두 선비 심이디 셴바 중고로 와. 언디나지레 나주다 돈이 또한 지당 나주로 마도바 지리야 유디 그래서 나와인데 대나신 나와인데 그 돈이 또한 디기 나와나신 싸우기네 요 말해 선비 가지고 시원한 심이디 심명원에 말해 선비기 심미로 있는 거이나 심명원에 말해 선배선마다 심미에 선배 균해요 말고 돈이 또한 될래 되는 시어와 나와. 당 하나도 길라 심이 그런 거 오프닝 할래 심미 신다 두 선비게 삼는 시어 봐나 제상 하나주기 나와도 나와나신 다 두 선비 심바 딜이 거래. 지금 디베로시 디로 책으로 와.
To give another illustration to show the difference between how an ordinary being and an ordinary bodhisattva relates to the same object. So again, they're looking at the same object, it's appearing to their mind as truly existent, but the way they relate to it is completely different, or is vastly different rather. So to give another illustration to make this point, take a reflection. If we see a reflection of ourselves in the mirror, no big deal, we know it's a reflection. It appears to our face appears to us in the mirror, but we know that that is a reflection. It's not our twin. We recognize this. We're not confused. But your pet, or maybe we've seen the videos on YouTube, when an animal sees a reflection in a mirror, sometimes they're confused. They think there's another animal there. So here, your pet at home or yourself, you're both seeing the same object, a reflection in the mirror, but you're relating to it in a vastly different way. So too, with the ordinary bodhisattva and ourselves, with whatever object appears to the mind, for us, we believe that what's appearing is correct, is true. The Bodhisattva knows that it is false.
Dini inza da ngara juge samlo nala khari yongwa sene nga se samtai nga se samtai lamsa nga se di nga di kala ya ma de rang ngwe ni lue pha sha ba da jin chai xie shan la ma de rang ngwe ni zhup de kala ma de ba nga ji yo re sen be lo hen ge le ya dini ge lo jin be jin ba shung go re de jin ba de la da sin mari pa la ge re ani de le ya jikta la ge ro.
The ignorance that grasps at the self as existing in the way that it appears as being independent of parts, of causes, of imputation by mind, is the ignorance of self-grasping. Or it's the view of the transitory collection, or the ignorance of true grasping.
Di chela and dini ge samlo leje dini ge samlo di chela ya da ma zu tue sha ye ya da kong zhe ye da de nyomo ba ye di wang ge da ting zu ge xian la de ba ye la so ba da an ji dini yong guo le xie.
And from this ignorance of true grasping, all our other afflictions follow: pride, anger, attachments, and so forth. And from the arisal of these non-virtuous minds follow non-virtuous behavior, harmful verbal behavior, harmful physical behavior.
Na dine si yongda de bene syungbu re sen dine gi ma ane ya ji ge bene dawa dra be uma ju ba na le ya sunggo re dang bo nga xie da la xian yu ji da gi di xie ngwe la cha ye ba ane su jun chan da rang wa me ba yi ro la ni ji gi ru de la du se ne ane ya che che ka le du song wa re uma ju ba na.
The verse we've just looked at is from Chandakirti's supplement to the Middle Way in the 6th chapter. Now, I want to quote another verse from the 1st chapter, also then by Chandakirti. Beings think I at first and cling to self. They think of mine and are attached to things. They thus turn helplessly as buckets on a water wheel. To compassion for such migrators, I bow.
Jizanda ngara zugila deji karasene nyomo ba da khobi kyen chasa zawa jisula den jungwa re la ro da jizan di jungtha de dangbo nga shi be nga chim be chele de yungures de kan des yungure la be dangbo nga je da la shin yur chen se ngara zu le gare chewi ne dangbo nga zu sam na nga se ji sam li go re se di li go ro da nga zu ge nga tu gi nga de gi nga khala sa gi an jing ngi le ga di chi gi se ji li go ro jizan dangbo nga se sam li go re je de dangbo nga je da la shin yur chen se de jing nga se sam li du na de ji she ba na jing nga se de nga zu lo li pa na yu de kan dang go sen gang la ye ma de ba lue pa sha ba la ma de ba Korangwene Jubashi Nangores, Nawanashin, Dagaran Singore Ejere, Dambo Denis Samlo Zimbige, Nazing around to get a Kigo Ejere.
The first line then is, as we've been looking at thus far, beings think I at first and cling to self. So here, the I appears to one's mind as being independent of causes, of parts, of imputation by mind. So when we think of ourselves sitting here, the way we think of ourselves is that we are independent. Similarly, with our activity of listening or reflecting, we think, I am listening, I am reflecting, and the sense of I is that we are independent of causes, parts, and imputation by mind. And then we cling to the self. So the first line again, beings think I at first and cling to self. So we cling or grasp at the self. This is the ignorance of self-grasping.
Dene nga sebe nga rashin juba zimba zinchin an di jela samna kalegre sene dagi di shi ngwe la cha ye ba so de dene dagi ngei supo ngei lapa ane chi ngei chala ngei punja ane ngei nyen se ane ngei zhao Zene jig susugi nyen la da, su chapiki chakpaki da, susugi ode ngi dawore, ngi ngale nyobi res dine ngi to jine an delia an dangwa kia chakdang kia. Jisnada chakpi wangi garji worsene, nga delia jig lega mangbuchi delia wangi nga lesa alia mangose bene chakpaki de susugi jigi dogo la chakpaki ne shengu horna ya la soba da, shen soju ya la soba da, an shen le zun shi ya la soba da, nyomo biritin chasa diligoro wa, ani nga kia da, jisna dinigi chasa diligore, jisna dinigi ane Delia and Dawaki, Delia and Kondokia, the Kondoki, Diwang, Shana Nevakia, this is just do see Nyomo, but this legal rege, just Dambong, Seven Rashin to but sympathy. Diwang getting Nay Pun, Nay Chala, Nay, just then Ngala Nugu, Ngala Pengus, Denichin, Nay said Dele, Chataki, Ejere.
Look at the first two lines. Beings think I at first and cling to self. They think of mine and are attached to things. Having given rise to, having grasped at the self as existing in the way that that it appears to one, from this I comes mine. So this then is where our attachment immediately follows. With the sense of I, we have mine. In dependence on the sense of I, we have mine, my friends, my enemies. And in dependence on this mine comes all our other afflictions, all the variety of activities we engage in order to fulfill our desires, or to repel others, or to repel situations. So because of the initial I follows the mine, my friends, my enemies, my wants, my wishes. From the mind then follows all a variety of other activities, mental, verbal, and physical, trying to gain what I want or to repel what I don't want.
Dinigi nyomoji ne nyomo lesa gurwa. Da lesa wanza dan gali orsen sujun chade rawa meba yise. Sujun chende rawa meba yise. Sujun chen peroshi, sujun chen senang zuki bene chuchenpa nalma dinglu dino kolo korachi, kolo chim kolo relia ane chigi zuki bakit dashaben du skorachi du chudima chen yali du skorachi du ko korachi du dina de rawas kayo mar di chul nye dike rawa mewa che du korachi ko rawa yo ma ko maru kabre ma du gore kabre ma chudin ma kabre yali go yang ma du sun kidina du sun korachi jab du go rawas kayo marwa dina shin ma zo karsne dinigi nyomo ba ke nyomo bo wangi le sa le ye wangi ko wale ke wale kabre ya ne mil ke wale ka le ya ga sana mi da hada mil ke wale Dile yagasina and ya Jesudan Sumelia Kiawale. And then Maje, Gabriel Ma, Dundrel Ma Kiawale, Gabriel Ma Nyawale Kiawale, Tushin Yakora Korchin, Gidina, Dinekora Dugo, Reshe, down to Leda, Nyomo Badi Ongi, and Diniki Koala Kora Dugo, Rangoyo Mares, Cousin Leda, Nyomo Milia, Nakola Minikanga do drive me la medes, Cousin Leda, Nyomo, Onge Lesa, Savicella, David Miades. Coming to
the third line, I'll read the first two first, because it shows the sequence of events, the sequence of where we find ourselves. Beings think I at first and cling to self. They think of mine and are attached to things. They thus turn helplessly as buckets on a water wheel. So the third line again, they thus turn helplessly as buckets on a water wheel. So first, there's the appearance of I that we grasp at, and from this the self-grasping then comes the thought, from I comes mine, and from this then come all our other afflictions. From the afflictions come contaminated karma is accumulated. And here then, the wheel of samsara continues to turn. From the contaminated karma accumulated by our afflictions, with ignorance at its root, our own individual samsaras continue to turn. Here our samsara is likened to a water wheel, and ourselves are likened to the water within the buckets on a water wheel. They thus turn helplessly as buckets on a water wheel. In the same way that the water in each bucket has no control over where that water is taken, we too have no control over ourselves as long as we remain bound in samsara. We are beings without freedom. We are beings whom are helpless. And the line again, they thus turn helplessly as buckets on a water wheel. So we are likened here to the water in these buckets that is without freedom over where it goes. Our next thought naturally arises, spontaneously arises. Our next rebirth will come about in dependence on the power of causes and conditions, and including our karma, as well as where that rebirth will be. Whether it's again in a happy migration or we fall into the lower realms. And this is the state of all sentient beings. This life can end at any moment, in dependence on a variety of causes, and ordinary beings have no freedom in this. Thought after thought arises in an uncontrolled way, grasping at the true existence of these objects, arises in an uncontrolled way. Beings are without freedom. And in this way, we continue to remain bound in the suffering realms of samsara, tormented moment by moment by suffering.
Jisa dine toni mato ba ina, jisa toni mato ba ina, dine gida tambo nga sebe nga rangshin drupa chimba chike, and dela dine ta ngi punja, ngi chala, ngi sacha, dine gichin, and chawa chatake, ngi chawas chatake, di wangi, and lenga basa, dine chin, and ba 코알 기네 타려 기네 메팅 기디나 코알 바코라 잡체 가브레 미리케 가브레 하라케 가브레 녀와케 가브레 두네 두 지나 코라 콘 디고레스 덴두스 디고레스 데네두 지나 삼다데 데네기 라메바 코알 코르 디게 닝자 선비게 돌라 닝지 귤강 세데 데네기 도 데네기 심젠지 동알라 타나 데네기 삼다지 데네 동알 심젠지 동알라 자고도 선비 동알라 다나 선비게 닝지 쳔보데라 아니 benendawadabage ya cha sewa yinse drola niji gyurgang dela du denigi drowa semjen denigi dungage na duge semjen desol ya dungana taduge samno niji de masi shibu za shibu shu jesha sambege delya ania cheba yinse jesan benendawadabage oma juba je du kabla ya sangye dan ya cheba ma juba je ani garle cheba je niji shimbol cheba yinse dangbo.
This is the position that we each find ourselves in, as well as all other sentient beings. This vast multitude of beings that fill the realms of samsara, we are in this position. Without having realized emptiness, we continue to grasp at the self. And from self-grasping follows the sense of mine, my family, my loved ones, my possessions, my wants, my opinions, my desires. And from the sense of mine, all the other afflictions follow, and contaminated karma is accumulated. And in this way, samsara continues to turn. Reflecting like this, we come to the fourth line. So I'll read the last two together. They thus turn helplessly as buckets on a water wheel. To compassion for such migrators I bow. So here Chandrakirti, at the start to this phenomenal text on emptiness, is praising compassion. And he's utilizing wisdom to generate compassion for beings who lack freedom, beings who long for freedom, but have yet to experience a moment of actual freedom in any lifetime because they remain blinded by ignorance. So therefore, using his own understanding of reality, he generates compassion for suffering, blinded beings.
Elia, Niji Chimbole, Chuba, Jugoba, the Gimsen Garelas, Niji Chimbot Be, Massing Janju Sim Gela Gelia, Lam Yamle, Janju Sim Gula Gewa, so Niji Chimbo de Gugures. Niji Chimbo de Gula Gematuna, Semjan Duana, Jana, Sempiga, Niji Chimbo Gula Gematubaina, Janju Sim Gula Ge 2 minutes, Janju Sim Ge, the Niji Latin Gig to us. Chizan Niji Japan as a Ge Chimbores. That Janju Sim Ge Tarne. When the Janjusem Ge, you sabun road, it's our Niji Chambores, Chizan Zavich Nichambores. That Janjusem Ge and the Janjusem Baru Chas on your Lam, Topo Yule Gesawa in a and then you get Sanjo Coupon is Janjusem Top Tower in a and then Niji Mebaina and then young Simja Tamjik Dona Sanjo Coupon Toya Dondal, the Lea Pisu Chigmares, Chizan Badu, Nanzo, when the Sabon Yugi Sanaya, Yugia Church, Yarga Royala, Chudan Lu Urua, Dinashi, Nichibody, Chudan Ludubres, Chizan Badu, Jesum Gulaki Savan, the Yargo Compot Diet, Nijil Rally Gores, Niji. Badu and Gachimbo, Tambo, Niji, Janjusum Giala, Niji Gachimbo Shure, Delatine, Niji Managers get to a marriage, the Nichimbo, Tambo, sometimes Gachimbo Shure. Janjusum Gis, Havi Jella, Niji, but Bardu Mevana, Janjusum Yamlan Yarget down to Martinza, Nichimbo, Barduya, Kin Chule, the Rawachibare. That's Sanji go on top Savaina. Then Niji Magomba Karchagri Lamna, Sanji go on top Sana Niji Kugur, Carson. Semjenlia, Semje Dunga da Dana, Sempe Nijimena, Semjen Dunga say to the Tablam Chu Ting Marwas. Chisa Che Sanji Kupon Toba in there, Semjen Dunga, Semjengilia Dunga da Dray Chedo, Tablam Chu Tembadi, Niji Ongi Dingores, Chisan Jebu, Mimba da Java, Jebu Rustat, Mimba da Java did it. Chisan Dinsa, Niji Chempo de Dangbonia, Sanji Kupon to Janjusim Yamlen Java, Tomaya Geshambo Shure. Bardoya Gishimbo, Tamadea Gish, Sanjogo, Topsana Nichimbo Gishimbo, Nichimbo, Tomada, Tamada, Tota Barsum the Gishimbo, Tezenza, Nichimbo, Bemasi Gishimbo Shuenza, Deniza, Yunden Chimbo, Denizimbaza, and Delia Chasavare, Janjusim Gegu, Gudia, Nichimbo, Latini Kidu, Janjusim Gies and Lam Yamlin to the Sanjogo, Yargetana Dele, Nichimbo Digit and the Yargetangu. Sanji go top Sana, Shenlia Chu Sonya, the Shengi Dunga Seg, Tablam Dead, Niji Wonga Chidu, just a Niji Chimbo said, Tota Barsum the Gachimbo, Dinza, and Dambo, and Ben Daughter with the Nigi Gachimbo, Yesha, Sambig, Dang, and Dushine, Gomba Shejin, Ninchimbolia, Cheva, Ding Anjugi, the Nigi Pendant Daughter, but when Ninchimbo, Cheva, Jimson Gares, and do some Dado, and didn't read was Mangazo Hagoy, Dondala. Gine Dine Chagore, Jeza Dineza, Nichimbol Show Chivari, this morning. Jeva. Oh, Jevunashi, Jevu, Mimba Jevunashi.
It may seem surprising that in this famous and phenomenal text about how to train to realize emptiness, that at the outset it is great compassion that is praised. But this was done by Chandrakirti for a specific reason. And this is because throughout one's training we need to rely on great compassion. It is of paramount importance throughout our training. It's of paramount importance at the beginning, the middle and end of one's training. So great compassion is of paramount importance at the outset because it is the primary cause to generate bodhicitta and enter into the paths of a bodhisattva, to give rise to the mental path of a bodhisattva and be counted amongst bodhisattvas. So therefore, great compassion is the seed from which bodhicitta grows. Then in the middle, while we're training along the paths of a bodhisattva, great compassion remains of paramount importance. It is and bodhisattva here, a great compassion here is likened to the watering of the seed, in that it's our compassion that keeps the bodhisattva striving in their spiritual development, but for the sake of others. It gives them the strength to striving for this distant goal of Buddhahood for the sake of others. And when Buddhahood itself is achieved, great compassion is still required, because it's great compassion at the end, which is now the result of all the training, that is required in order for the Buddha to keep benefiting sentient beings in the most perfect of ways until each and every sentient being attains their own individual enlightenment. So therefore, because great compassion is indispensable at the beginning, the middle, and the end, Chandakirti praises it here at the outset of his phenomenal text. So I'm mentioning this here so that all of us can know this and keep it in mind, keep this motivation in mind for ourselves too.
Kibu Chimbo dan, Kibu Chungo dan, Jing dan, Chimbio Lam Yamle Shedu, Damongazu Kibu Chungi Kabla Shedu Kabla, and Yamlen Garacheva Shevarela, Nanganzugida. Ada Kiwa Chima, Nyawada, Yida, Durangasung, Dunga to get the Tawures, Dunga Dene Yore, Sati Sherwa. And dying as a give Jingi Lam Yamlen Jeva Kabla Shedu, Tangansong la Tabine, Lada Mukovatum the Jigger, and Desami Jigmar, Lada Mukovana, Kora Mabamba, Chizanganzuki, Kabaduji, Dunga Yore, Chizangazulet, Navi Dunga, and the Kabi Dunga Mambo Lilia, Dunga Mambo Yunga, Chesa Semia Ganga, Dunga, Lugi, Dunga Mambo, Chesa Deneza, Dunga Payo Mares, Chesan, the new Korvigi, Chetajala, Taguri, Sachi, Yamle Chevore di Sherwa. Chesan di. And then Taba Chimpigi Yamlenkala Shidukabla, that Rangchibu Maime, Semjan Tamjig Dunga, some the Dunga Tatalu drag, Dundala, Niji Chimbo, Yamlen Chehore, saying Taba Chimpigi, Yamlen Chena, didn't Chehore, said Kissing, down to Kibu Chunga Lamirimba, the Jingle Lamirimba, Kibu Chimbe Lamirimbe Kablia, Dusu, then the city share, what else she said, what is on.
When we started looking at this text, 2.5 years ago, we would have started by looking at the beginning trainings that one engages in, and those were the trainings shared with a practitioner of initial capacity. So here, the meditations come about in dependence on understanding the sufferings that beings are experiencing in the lower realms, and that one has achieved this precious opportunity whereby one can attain freedom, at least for the next rebirth, from these lower realms. So one here gives rise to determination to gain freedom from rebirth in the lower realms and rebirth as a human or God. Then we continue to look at the trainings that are shared with a practitioner of intermediate capacity. And a practitioner of intermediate capacity recognizes that the superior rebirths as a human or God remain pervaded by suffering. And that is because there is no pleasure in samsara that is uncontaminated. There is no lasting freedom from pain and misery that can be experienced as long as one remains bound in samsara. And thereby, the practitioner training in the practices shared with the being of intermediate capacity gives rise to determination to gain freedom not just from the lower realms, but from samsara in its entirety. And this has come about through reflecting and suffering in great detail. The suffering of physical mental pain, the suffering of transient pleasure, and all-pervasive suffering. In dependence on these two trainings, one comes to the practices that are unique to a practitioner of supreme capacity. And to enter into the paths, or to attain the paths of a practitioner of supreme capacity, one trains in bodhicitta. And here, bodhicitta has as its root cause great compassion. And that is what is being praised in this verse.
Da kiwi dringi kabla samdaya ki da jigi nga zo lada mi dunga da da kiwi chimbi ka sa de 하 심전 탐제 아니 되니기 냐와 베나다 하이나다 미나 차사 둥하다 자고 둥하자 되니기 둥하 차사 다 가르 용으로 해서 되니기 둥하야 유디 가르친 용으로 세데 레기원이 깨와래 세고로 왔다 레기원이 디링셔야 디디시 오래 레기원이 디디 차사다 예 둥하디 차사 깨 레기원이 깨와래서 레 대양 아니 가르치네 뇽모몽이 끼오래 되자 콩로 되자당 콩로 마케바나 되자 콩로 뇽모바메나 량한 바삭 말와 량한 바마사나 냐와지야마 dunro지야야 말와 제자 량한 바삭 말 강아요 제자 레지 왕게 용거래 레디양 규디 가르선 뇽모몽이 용거래스 제자 뇽모바디야 제위 규디 가르선 나 세베 나라신 다도 주바지면 다선들리고래스 제자 나저 가르 제자 두치 당아저 강아요 그 자와디 가르도 시스네 다시 말이 버려봐 임바다 하고 와시 당한도 매바 써야돼 가르소서 다시 말이 버려 매바 써야야 탑시 비즈니스 오래 니 매바 써봐이나 다시 말이 버려 매바 써봐이나 뇽모바기야요 말레스 대샤 콘랑아자로 뇽모바기 말레스 뇽모바마기나 뇽모바 량한 바사요 말레 량한 바사 마사나 아니 코발이야 녀 코베 둥을 코발이야 wal링 말레스 진짜 둥아녀하요 말레스 가와기와 리그슨 야가시기와 둥아 메켄 사지 야고시기와 다가시 진짜 둥아 용 말했어. 진짜 니네서 디방고 그래서 다시 말이 받을 방고 그래서 디바야기 녀보디 짐바던 수준 쇠발라서 받는 게 방투 말. 그래 녀보 가르선 동유튜브 쉐어를 해. 진짜 동유튜브 쉐어 디기 아니 저게 다시 말이 방투 그래야지. 진짜 다 동유튜브 쉐어서 나 라시 마주버도 베시럽대. 대신 안 주들래 나세 나와는 랑은데 주버 진되어와 델야가 제바제 나세 랑은 나와 나신 민두 선배 하고 봐이나 디 요래 선배로 메시르고래 디시소네 딘 뇽모바 디가르고래 기에메와 차르고래 녜말레 사바이네 뇽모베나 니메나 녜말레 nga지냐와다 기에가 레가서 사여나 뇽모메마 차소나 아니 레여나 퀄리티 완전해요 말에 베나가서 사본지여베네 디 게 니보 요르테나 사다 추르메나 고 가제샤스나 뉴기야요 말와 디나지 지바레서 그러다
These two verses that we've looked at tonight from Chandrakirti's supplement to the Middle Way, both of them, they share so much in common. So the first verse we looked at starts with having seen with intelligence that afflictions and faults without exception arise from the view of the transitory collection. And then the second verse we looked at started with beings think I at first and cling to self. They think of mine and are attached to things. So that's in brief, but these two verses we can apply to our understanding of the entire Lam Rim. The practitioner of initial capacity, who's coming to first recognize the sufferings that beings experience in the lower realms and potentially await oneself, and giving rise then to a determination to gain freedom from such a rebirth. Through this understanding here, we recognize how such rebirths are attained and why such suffering comes about. Secondly, for the practitioner of intermediate capacity, who has recognized also the sufferings that pervade the so-called upper migrations of humans and gods, we recognize what binds beings into even the happier migrations. This too is the afflictions. And when we look at it then from the perspective of the practitioner of supreme capacity, what is preventing the aspirant bodhisattva or the bodhisattva herself from becoming a Buddha for the sake of others? It will still be the afflictions and their seeds or their imprints. Here then, looking at the entire graduated stages of the path to enlightenment, with this understanding, we see that all beings remain trapped in the suffering realms of samsara due to the contaminated karma accumulated by their own afflicted minds, and these all have as their root cause their own individual ignorance of self-grasping. This then, when we come to see this with vivid clarity, determination will arise within us to come to know this, to recognize this for ourselves, recognize what keeps us bound in these suffering realms of samsara, recognize that we need to abandon the ignorance of self-grasping, because when we do sever it, no afflicted mind will come. As we saw here, first comes the grasping at I, and then the mine. And from this come all the afflictions. So we sever the grasping at a self, and then no resultant afflictions or contaminated karma will follow. And thereafter, we gain freedom from uncontrolled rebirth in samsara. Freedom from samsara, freedom from suffering. So therefore, the root cause of all our pain and misery, the root cause of all our torment and misery, is the ignorance of self-grasping, and this is what we must abandon. And it cannot be abandoned through generosity alone, ethical restraint alone, patience alone. It can only be abandoned by the wisdom realizing emptiness. So therefore, we need to recognize how the self appears to us. Investigate then, does it exist in the way that it appears to us or not? And come to recognize that it does not exist in this way at all. And lastly, recognize that the self exists as a mere imputation by mind. All of this then comes about in dependence on training in the way that has been prescribed.
당아도 삼는 스타베네 당아 소소라 레가라 치카레 체기나 당보 삼나 카르코도 삼지 소소라 삼다베네 나 세삼들 레기도 민도 지가도 삼 심주치나 도스지는 다이 나도 치로치 조웨나 당보 가서 가서서는 치로치 조웨나 나 세삼 리고 가서는 나 세삼 레지네 든지 지와 추이 잡고 뒤에 다지 나 세지 치료데 야지 수고다 되지 약원에 매나 근데 나 야고 마존에 미견식을 생겼어 나 선생님 아직 수고줘야 라서 받아 전에 나 섬제 한국 거야 돼 강받지 말고 한다 지가 세디 레지는 이 강받 나기 나서 당길 규칙 그랬으면 나 지상 아주 가래지 내가 가래지 나봉아 세삼 리디 거와 또 제가 심주치에 나 진행 아 셀레서지나 되네 네이잖아 자다 네 레가래서 야구 중국어서 단 나랑 레가래 야구 연구해서 배삼나 제다 안데 나래야 지치 야구 그래서 지 나래야 견지신데 네이디 레가들이야 빠지지나 야구 말씀 배삼도 되네 네 리도 아디 등한서 심주체 두 제베도 나봉아 삼리고 되네 네세 두신 팔레네 되네 되샤게야 코르게야 당아게야 되게 두신 연구로 와다 두신 가지고 심두 삼다베나 두세 삼다데 가르가르 연구도 등한서 심주체베나 소스테스에서 라고라고디 하고 두고와 안디네 삼다는 가서 삼다데 제가 당아 제 삼다데 되는 가 셀레데 나세도 제데 나 세제도 롤이야 간시 능도 제데 심주체들 와다 가서 롤이야 소속에 가서 삼다데 간데라도 삼다베나 나도 수고당 풍부하다 되네 간라야 아마도 그런 믹스가 로스 주여봐 로징아서 능거데 되네 능도에 민도 당아도 전에 나 삼다데 나 삼다데 나 세데 간시도 간시 능도 롤이야 간시 능도 스베 디심주를 제고 차고를 도 지나가지고 디링이 럽산디게 디삼다 제체 단 제마들랑아도다 나 다슨 디게 녀보 다음에 뭐 동반이 또 호연자 동반이 또 시럽 끼고자 다 동반이 또 시럽 끼야리야 동반이리야 간스 제바 제고도 시럽 끼대 간스 끼고도 이걸 마셔야지로.
All the previous meditations that we've looked at that have been shared with the being of initial capacity, intermediate capacity, and now those we previously looked at the trainings of a being of supreme capacity, they are all the building blocks, the graduated stages that have brought us to this point where we've accumulated merit, we've accumulated knowledge and wisdom, and now we come to the point where we meditate on emptiness. All those trainings have brought us to this point now. So the homework, for those who want homework, is to reflect on how the I appears. Right now, I am listening. Right now, I'm receiving homework. How does my sense of self appear? When we leave here tonight, you're walking to your car and you feel the cold of outside. How does the sense of I arise? When you're washing, how does your sense of I arise then? Or when you're thinking about, if I don't wash and I start to smell and people criticize me, how will my sense of I arise then? Or if I was outside and not wearing shoes, how would my sense of I arise when I'm walking outside on the rough and uneven ground? And then also, take then these illustrations in your daily life, not just now as you leave here, and also especially be aware of when the afflictions arise. Be aware when the afflictions arise and look for how that came from a sense of self. How from the self-grasping came the afflictions. From the I comes the mine, my friends, my wants, my views. And this is important homework, because to the degree that one can get a good idea for how the self appears, when one then sits in meditation, it will be easier to gain a feel for how the self appears to us. When you sit there and I am meditating, how the self appears, and then we have the basis to go into the next step of the meditation, which is to seek out that self. And that is what we'll look at next week then. The meditation to cultivate the wisdom realizing emptiness. The investigation to seek out the self, to see if it exists in the way that it appears or not.